For this lecture in the Political Ideologies class, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about hate groups and the related groups that deal with white supremacy or anti-Semitism or anti-government militia type groups. We've talked about radical Islam and how that has influenced some of the terrorist organizations out there in the world. But it's useful to make a distinction, particularly here in the U.S., with these types of groups. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks this, lists nearly 900 hate groups that are active in the United States today. And this is just a small smattering of them here. These are all just in the A's. When you looked at some of these Act for America, Alliance Defending Freedom, you may have heard of some of these alt-right movement, the American Nazi Party, probably the Aryan Brotherhood. So this is a combination of different types of groups that are categorized as hate groups that could be white supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-government, militia-type organizations. One thing that we have to keep in mind is that despite the continued focus on foreign terrorist organizations, we do see a growing threat, in some cases a larger threat, from what is called the homegrown type of domestic terrorists. This quote from former Justice Department official: in the U.S., more people are killed by far-right extremists than by those who are adherent to Islamist extremism. So as that before, I kind of stressed that previous couple of lectures, is regardless of the ideology, there's going to be extremist elements to that ideology, including religions. Large majority of the jihadist terrorists in the United States have also been American citizens or legal residents, 93% of them male, no surprise there, but looking at the breakdown by an organization that tracks these as well, 83% of the jihadist-related terrorists are actually citizens or permanent residents. So they have been radicalized while they were here in the United States. The New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness came out with a report last year, and they put at the top of their list the highest warning would be from groups such as homegrown violent extremists, white supremacist extremists. Highest rating as far as being on the lookout for. In the moderate range, you have your anarchist extremists, your anti-government extremists, black separatist extremists, militia extremists, and sovereign citizen extremists, which are also anti-government in a way. And all of those are higher in warning ratings than all of the foreign terrorist organizations that you see in this group here. The Department of Homeland Security came out with a report, Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence, in September 2019. And what I've done, I've just pasted their executive summary here. So even just when the DHS was founded, foreign terrorist organizations were a big priority, and they remain a big priority to watch out for, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, returning foreign fighters, things like that. Today, they note, we face a growing threat from domestic actors inspired by violent extremist ideologies, as well as attacks by those who are not ideologically driven. And this creates a unique challenge to traditional law enforcement investigations. So they note here, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, in particular violent white supremacists, is one of the most prevalent and abhorrent of these anti-American ideologies. So that shows you how we have kind of shifted our focus over the past couple of decades as the domestic homegrown terrorists are becoming as much as or more than a threat than the radical jihadists. But again, it's part of this big mix that we all have to keep on the lookout for. There's a book published in 1971 that is worth noting, because we've talked about some other books that turned out to be fairly influential on certain types of thinking, radical thinking. The Anarchist Cookbook was written by a teenager in 1971 in protest of the Vietnam War. It was basically a do-it-yourself manual on making drugs and making weapons and explosive devices, and had been cobbled together from military manuals and various other anarchist publications. Since that time, it has been linked to dozens of terrorist attacks in the United States and around the world, not necessarily as the sole cause, but are part of the ingredients or the equation that led to these attacks, such as abortion clinic bombings, as well as the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the Columbine school shootings in 1999, the July 7th London bombings 2005, Boston Marathon bombing 2013. The author of the book, before his death in 2016, he'd long been remorseful about the book, said he grossly underestimated the controversy it would provoke. So this is just another example of a publication that seems to have caught on over time and inspired some of these radical hate group thinking. Now let's review a little bit fascism in modern times here, and this is where I'm going to go back to Chapter 7. So review Chapter 7 because some of this is going to be taken back out of that. So when we look at current fascists and Nazi-inspired parties that were originally outlawed in Germany, well, they've started a resurgence and called neo-fascist or neo-Nazi parties, which continue to run and have been seeing somewhat of a resurgence here in the last decade or so. And the ultranationalism, talked about that a couple of times. The push back towards nationalist-leaning sentiments has also picked up. We've talked about what has inspired that. It's also kind of correlated with the pushback against democracy, because the more nationalist-leaning sentiments is also going to inspire more authoritarian-type leaders. But we've got, particularly over the past decade or so, groups that have, looking at Europe, in fact, growing hostility to immigration. That, of course, a lot of that was inspired by the immigration from the Middle East, civil wars there. France's National Front Party was formed around that and has actually gained some seats in their parliament. Also, the withdrawal from the EU is part of what inspired the UK Independence Party, and it gained enough attraction to inspire Brexit. And they are, in fact, in the process of exiting from the EU. Anti-Muslim parties have formed. Netherlands' Geert Wilders has been a celebrity for quite a while, promoting anti-Muslim sentiment, and has picked up traction there. The Belgian court actually outlawed neo-fascist parties, but they are starting to regroup. We have seen a resurgence of these parties, particularly in the last decade or so. Racial violence has increased in places such as Ireland, France, and in Denmark. The decline of democracy, as well as the rise of nationalism, has all somewhat correlated over the past decade or so. When we look at the global recession and the fear of terrorist groups and the anti-immigration sentiment, all of that combining over the last decade or so has increased fears that populist-type leaders can then capitalize on and gain traction as far as becoming more nationalist-leaning in their ideologies. And then as what populism, how it's defined, well, people pick up on that and they start to gain traction and even get seats in parliament and get elected leaders of countries. Greece's Golden Dawn Party is one of those types of groups that gained recognition, particularly in the aftermath of the recession. Greece was having a hard time recovering from that, so it inspired a lot of nationalist-leaning sentiment because of what Greece had been required to do by the EU as far as austerity-type measures. And it was a neo-Nazi that was in Norway back in 2011, murdered 77 people. Most of them were young people at a youth camp there. So some examples here of growing fascism. What feeds it in the nationalism is a key ingredient. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be moving towards totalitarian control, but it is a direction towards establishing totalitarian control to bring that nationalist sentiment back in. There's a tendency to equate Islamofascism with nationalism, but as we've described with radical Islamism, it is more of a desire for theocracy that actually spans countries and tries to unite all people of that faith. So not necessarily the same as nationalism as we described earlier with Islamism and then the radical Islamism. In the U.S. in particular, the militia groups, that's in quotations because the United States hasn't needed an actual militia for a long time. And what's even more ironic is that these malicious groups are the opposite of what the government intended them for to be. So militia groups also play on numerous fears, particularly in the United States. Anti-Semitism, the pushback of any form of internationalization, which would be cooperation and coordination with any foreign countries that has foreign people in it. The perception that white men are losing power and being disarmed, that there's some nostalgia that's driving the ideas of men used to be in power and are getting pushed out of power. So that's part of what drives some of that. Then the anti-government sentiment, which particularly if a liberal-leaning administration is elected, then there might be a little bit more of a pushback from the far-right groups, which do tend to predominate some of these groups. And then they make ample use of propaganda, particularly with patriotism, which feeds this nationalism that, coming back in and focusing on America at the expense of other countries or actually opposed to other countries. And there's lots of buzzwords and topics out there that tend to unite people along these lines. Any form of affirmative action, which is trying to ward against discrimination and racism, but from this viewpoint, it's sometimes considered anti-white discrimination, reverse discrimination, things like that. Gun control is another term that really inspires a lot of opposition by gun rights advocates. The anti-immigrant sentiment, we've already talked about that. Even the current administration kind of ran on a platform of anti-immigration, so that inspires a little bit more of that nationalist sentiment. The concept of minorities becoming in power, we'll see that even the election of Barack Obama really inspired quite a bit of movement as far as white supremacist hate-type groups. The mass media is typically a target of these type groups, labeled as a liberal media with fake news that are trying to report on the activities of the groups that obviously disagree with the reporting. And the brain being brainwashed by the system could go either way, where the propaganda could be trying to tell people that you're brainwashed by the system, where analysis might be trying to figure out how white supremacists and hate groups are being brainwashed by their members. So that kind of goes both ways. We'll talk about that a little bit more. First of all, it's worth backtracking a little bit and talking about this concept of a social construction, particularly the social construction of race. In America in particular, because we're a very diverse society, and even though we do have ethnic groups, those have melded and blended into a salad bowl or a melting pot that has created somewhat of an American culture, whereas in most other countries, those ethnic lines, as I've talked about, have been at the heart of a lot of conflict because of those divisions that go beyond these superficial traits that I'm going to be talking about. They are more looking at historical differences, language differences, religious differences. Those are kind of at the heart of those. But in America, we have had a tendency to construct the concept of race. Obviously, it does matter. And there are differences. There is still discrimination. There still is racism. But when we look at how it's also a construction, what we call race, and that's why I have race in quotation marks here. Race is somewhat problematic a way of classifying humans because of what it's based on, and that's primarily on physical characteristics, such as most predominantly facial traits and skin color. So it's superficial visual things that are setting people apart. But when you go back and look at the evolution of humans, what we consider race, these superficial characteristics, these physical characteristics, are largely adaptation to climate, depending on how long your group was in a particular region of the world, which determines those physical characteristics. And in fact, when you look at the studies of humans all around the world, there are more differences within groups of people than there are between groups of people, because we share the same DNA. And the differences between any two people in a classroom, for example, is more than there would be between differences of groups of human beings. All humans have the same common ancestors. Humans have the same common origin in north central Africa, thereabouts, and then they migrated through over 100,000 years, perhaps more, migrated to the four corners of the globe, and the DNA has also shown that we all share the same DNA. However, what has happened since then, since we got separated up into our own different cultures, and then we started to construct our own traditions and norms in those individual cultures, and we were very dramatically separated as we formed our own religions and our own political organizations. So therefore, we became very separated, and that's what's caused a lot of the differences in humans around the world. However, even within a society, a group is defined based on these physical characteristics. Then those are used to imply hereditary or behavioral differences when they are just superficial differences. But once a group tends to get out that idea that you look different, so therefore you must be inherently different than me. So once that starts to get out and people latch onto that, then those are used to justify social differences. That you look different than me, so therefore I must be better than you, so therefore I deserve more than you, or that my place in society is justified to be higher than you, whatever it may be used there in this social construction of race. So that is a kind of a recap of what that concept means. And since we are such a groupish species, one thing we have to keep in mind, groups, lots of them out there, they're culturally defined. We don't know what a group is until we form one. But the tendency to relate to groups is a human universal. We are a very groupish species because we evolved in small groups of human beings, small groups of hunter-gatherers, foragers, and for a couple of million years or more, that's how we became human. So that is inherent within us to want to group up with other people. So now we have to figure out what those groups are. And those groups are culturally defined, socially constructed. So once it is proposed that the enemy is an inherited category, while the identity of the group placed in that category is learned. So this is what we're kind of getting at here. This hatred of another group is a learned behavior, not inherent within us. The tendency to be in a group is, but the tendency to hate another group is a learned behavior. Looking at neo-Nazi ideology is the claim that racial differences are innate. So we talked about that. That's kind of what drove Hitler's philosophy of, based on racial superiority. And so that has lingered over the years with the neo-Nazi ideology, putting the emphasis on the differences, on the superiority. There's also the perceived fear of the Jewish liberal democratic egalitarian system that is pushing back perhaps against the rightful heirs to the power, particularly the whites, the Aryan type of race, fighting the system they feel is dividing that white race against itself. The Turner Diaries, we touched on that just briefly in Chapter 7, but Turner Diaries came about later on, long after Hitler, but it was another book that did inspire a lot of white supremacist groups. It was a futuristic fictional novel that advocating bombing the government, bombing the media, shooting down planes to get their point across, and even hanging race traitors. Even though it was a fiction book set in the future, it did inspire a lot of hate group mentality. And the neo-Nazi ideology would advocate that there's no elections necessary because the racially pure elite would just automatically be in control of things. And part of the socialization process, using propaganda, racist-leaning education to indoctrinate the children, just like Hitler was trying to do with the Hitler Youth in those days. This is a chart that came out of another peer-reviewed study that looks fairly convoluted, but it does provide an interesting kind of a maze as what is the background of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, because there are some common elements with those groups there. So you look at the generalized influences here of conspiracy theories about Jews, even some mythological things, the ethno-racial white supremacy, even some paganism type of beliefs here. So you've got your religious influences over here. You've even got some eugenics, some scientific racism right here, and some more mythological elements here. And when we talked about in Chapter 7, we hit on these a little bit more heavily there. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a very prominent anti-Semitic tract that inspired Hitler. Henry Ford, anti-Semitic as well, was somewhat pro-Nazi until he was discredited. Mein Kampf, we talk about that as Hitler's book that he wrote that formulated his ideas. So then you come across the board here and you can see the types of groups that we have in today's world: Ku Klux Klan, Aryan nations, fascist political groups, anti-government groups, skinhead groups, youth culture, national alliances. Here's some groups that may not be as popular as they may have been, pagan neo-Nazis. Interesting flow chart there I thought I'd just share since we're talking about these generalized hate groups. Looking more on militia groups, which we saw by 2007, the number was down pretty dramatically to 148. But at the election of Obama, they increased dramatically to 1,200. This is where we see something counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you analyze it. As you can see, with the election of Barack Obama, they spiked dramatically. And what that tends to suggest is that the people that are likely to join these groups felt a little bit more fearful because of the election of a black man, liberal Democrat. And so therefore the groups were more emboldened to try to form, and perhaps a gun control leaning administration is in power, then that would inspire a spike in gun sales. So that's kind of how that works. And then with the election of Donald Trump, we see they'd already started to decline because they probably felt less threatened with the second term of Obama. But even with the election of Donald Trump, Trump has indicated on a couple of occasions that he's a little bit more empathetic towards some of these groups, trying to perhaps straddle the line a little bit there. And so therefore those groups may not feel as threatened with someone like Donald Trump in the White House. So that's how that works, what you might say counterintuitively than what you might expect of the movement of these groups. But the militia groups do have some common elements, fondness for firearms, so that's why they do tend to identify with more further right-leaning politics, on guard against big government, which is kind of ironic considering the right side of government is just as big as the left side when you look at government programs and the types of policies that the conservative side of politics wants to promote compared to the types of policies that the liberal side wants to promote. They're both looking at making government bigger as far as what's important to them. This differs a little bit from the fascist idea of concentrating power in the single state party. So again, more irony here in that the nationalist concept would put centralized power in a very authoritarian state, where these groups are anti-government. So what happens then? So that's why there's all types of contradictions that abound in these types of ideology. So what I wanted to do is just expound on this a little bit, talk a little bit more about ideologies that are associated with hate groups and white supremacist group, anti-Semitic groups, and anti-government groups.